In chess, having a precisely crafted plan is absolutely crucial. An effective strategy is more than just individual moves. It's a carefully coordinated sequence of moves through which you can eventually achieve your positional goals. Today we examine Efim Geller's positional masterpiece that illustrates this principle at its best. Let's see how he executes a grandiose multi-step plan to completely squeeze his opponent and get a dominating position. Geller starts with e4 and his opponent Miguel Najdorf plays the Sicilian defense, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and Najdorf opts for the Najdorf variation, a6, taking under control the b5 square, preventing the white pieces from occupying it, and preparing the queenside expansion by pushing the b pawn to b5. Now white has different options. He might play bishop e3 or bishop g5 or bishop c4. In our game instead, Geller opts for a quiet and a more positional variation. He plays bishop e2. Now black has an option, either to push the e-pawn to e6 or to e5. In case he plays e6, of course the pawn would control the very important d5 square. On the other hand, black's position would be cramped. As you see, black army is placed on the first three ranks and black pieces are passive. For example, the light squared bishop cannot be developed on e6, as this square is occupied by the pawn. So instead of e6, which is perfectly playable, Najdorf plays e5, which on the one hand has a terrible drawback, as it permanently weakens the d5 square and the d6 pawn becomes backward. On the other hand, this move has advantages, because it's a more dynamic and more active variation. The pawn on e5 controls the important squares on white territory, kicking out the knight from d4, and the e6 square is vacated for the light squared bishop. So black gets a more active play, but he has a weakness on d5 and d6. The knight is attacked, so it retreats to b3, bishop e6 followed, Geller castles, knight d7, and Geller starts the expansion on the king side, f4, with the idea of pushing the pawn to f5 in order to grab more space on the king side and in the center and kick the bishop out of e6. Queen c7 followed. Now, of course, it doesn't make any sense for white to exchange on e5, because in this case, as you see at the moment, black has a backward weak pawn on d6, which is restricting black's bishop, but in case white exchanges on e5, black would solve all his problems, getting rid of the backward pawn and opening the bishop's diagonal. So, of course, Geller didn't capture on e5, instead he pushes the pawn forward, grabbing space and forcing black to move the bishop to c4. Now black is ready to push the pawn to b5, so Geller prevents it by playing a4. Also, he might play a5 later in the game in order to blockade and restrict black queenside. Rook c8 followed, occupying the half-open c-file, bishop e3, and in this position, as David Bronstein writes in his great book dedicated to this tournament in Zurich, it would be in the spirit, more in the spirit of the Najdorf variation, to sacrifice the pawn by pushing it forward. This pawn is backward, so by playing d5, black might get rid of this pawn, also opening the bishop's diagonal, after which white might capture on d5 either with a pawn or with the knight. In case he captures with a pawn, black has a strong move, bishop b4, developing the bishop, attacking the knight, which is the main defender of the d5 pawn, and threatening to capture on c3, followed by of course, knight takes d5, so the pawn would fall in this case and black would equalize. So after d5, it would be better, instead of e takes d, to capture with the knight. And in this case, black can exchange the knights, and after e takes d, exchange his bishop for the knight, and after c takes b, of course, white is up a pawn, but his extra pawn is doubled, as you see. His d5 pawn is also isolated and weak. Black solves his problems with his bad bishop, which used to be bad when the pawn was on d6, but now he can develop this bishop, exchanging it for white's great dark squared bishop. followed by short castle, after which black can play knight f6, putting more pressure on the weak d5 pawn, and it isn't clear if white can hold his extra pawn or not. Even if he does, of course, the pieces which would defend this pawn would be tied to the defense of this pawn, and black pieces would be very active, and black would be very close to equalize the position. But instead of d5, in this position, Nxd5 plays bishop e7, which is a little bit passive, of course. Now Geller pushes the pawn to a5 and blockades black's queenside. And in this position, again, it would be better for black to think about d5. For example, he could have exchanged the bishops, and after queen takes e2, he could have played d5. And again, in case white captures with the pawn, black has a very strong move, bishop b4, threatening to capture on c3, after which black can capture the pawn on c3, and of course, after the elimination of the knight, which defends the d5 pawn, this pawn might also fall, and black would equalize. But it seems that Nxd5 didn't feel like playing d5 in this game. Instead, he writes in his annotations that he was thinking about short castle. But in case he castles right away, white can start a very strong attack on the king side by playing g4 followed by g5. For this reason, Nxd5 plays h5, taking under control the g4 square and preventing the possible advance of the white g-pawn. However, this move, h5, proved to be a mistake because it weakens the king side, and, which is even more important, as Geller writes in his annotations, black loses valuable time and lets his opponent completely squeeze him. Because now Geller first exchanges the bishops, and after queen takes c4, as he pushed the a4 pawn to a5, now the a4 square is vacated, and a very strong move followed, rook a4. Kicking out the queen from c4, reinforcing the e4 pawn, and, which is very important, taking under control the b4 square. You will see why this is so important very soon. So the queen must retreat, it retreats to c7. Now black might play knight g4 next move, which might be unpleasant, attacking the unguarded bishop, so Geller prevents it by playing h3. And now you can see why controlling the b4 square is so important. It turns out that black cannot make the liberating d5 move anymore. In this case, white can simply capture with a pawn, and unlike in the previous variations, black cannot play bishop b4 anymore, because this square is controlled by the rook. So it turns out that black now is completely squeezed. Nxd5, however, plays h4. As he is completely restricted on the queen side and in the center, he hopes to create some counter chances on the king side. He, in his turn, blockades white's king side, and he might think about invasion on the weakened g3 square. Now Geller plays rook f2, defending the c2 pawn and liberating his knight. Now the knight can move, and black won't be able to capture on c2 anymore. For example, if black plays knight h5 in order to invade the g3 square, white can simply play knight d5 with a tempo centralizing his knight, attacking the queen, and black cannot capture on c2 anymore, as the rook defends this pawn. So, after rook f2, black's position looks completely squeezed. However, Nxd5 found a very interesting opportunity to create a counterplay. He plays b5, letting white capture en passant, of course. So, by playing b5, Nxd5 offers the pawn sacrifice. Geller, of course, captures en passant, and it turns out that the a6 pawn might fall. So, Nxd5 captures on b6, and it turns out that white can capture on a6, winning pawn with a tempo, attacking the knight for the second time, which at first sight looks as a perfectly sensible way to continue the game. However, Geller didn't capture the pawn because, as you will see, it would be in black's favor. So now you can pause the video and try to find what Geller did instead of capturing on a6. You should also think why rook takes a6 would be bad, and instead of rook takes a6 you should find Geller's epic multi-step plan. I will just give you a small tip. This plan aims to get a position with a dominating white knight on d5 against black's bad dark squared bishop. So, in case white captures on a6, Ned5 prepared, as his knight is under attack, he prepared knight c4 with a tempo, saving his knight, attacking the bishop and also the b2 pawn, and after the bishop retreats to c1, he prepared queen b7, attacking the rook and also attacking the e4 pawn for the second time. And after the white rook retreats, black would capture on e4 with the knight and get an active counterplay. So it would be in black's favor. Instead of this, instead of capturing on a6, now Geller starts the implementation of his plan. So, black has two pieces, two knights, which can defend the weakened d5 square. So Geller first exchanges his great bishop for the knight, because although this bishop is very strong, it is actually completely useless in the battle for the light square, because it's a dark squared bishop, while the knight is one of the main defenders of this square. So Geller captures on b6. And after queen takes b6, now you see that black has only one defender of d5, because the bishop is dark squared bishop and it cannot defend the light square, while white has the c3 knight, which already controls this square, and the second knight, which can potentially invade this square. In order to achieve this, the first step of Geller's plan is to restrict black major pieces and to tie them to the defense of the weakness on a6. In order to achieve that, he's going to play queen e2, attacking the a6 pawn for the second time. Then he's going to reroute his f2 rook to a1, attacking the a6 pawn for the third time, after which all black major pieces will be forced to defend this pawn, and black would be very passive and wouldn't have any chance to create any counterplay. After that, Geller will implement the second step of the plan. He will reroute the b3 knight via a5 to c4 and to e3, and from e3 the knight together with the c3 knight will control the d5 square. Then the third step of the plan. One of the knights will invade d5, exchange itself for the f6 knight, after which the second knight will invade d5 and the mission will be completed. White will get a great d5 knight against black's dark squared bishop. Let's see how Geller implemented all this. First, queen e2, threatening to capture on a6, so the rook must return to a8. Now white must unpin his rook, so he plays king h2. Black castles rook f1 in the anticipation of rook a1, which would attack the pawn for the third time. Ned5 plays rook a7, vacating the a8 square for the second rook. Rook a1, rook a8. So now, as you see, the black major pieces are tied to the defense of the pawn. And the bishop is bad, so there is nothing black can do. So Geller has time, he isn't in a hurry. In case he plays knight a5 right away, black might capture on b2. So Geller first defends the pawn. Rook a2. Bishop d8. Black wants to activate this passive bad bishop. In order to reach that, he's going to reroute the bishop to b6, from which it will become more active. Besides that, as the bishop is on this diagonal, black can push the a pawn forward, and on a5 the pawn will be defended by the bishop and the rooks will be free. So black is ready, for example, to move his queen from b6, opening the bishop's diagonal so that it controls the a5 square, and as soon as the knight invades a5, black would love to exchange his bishop for the knight. For this reason, Geller plays knight a5 right away, while the queen is still closing the bishop's diagonal. Rook c8 followed, knight c4 with a tempo attacking the queen. Of course, the knight is heading to e3. Queen c6 and knight e3 with the discovered attack on the a6 pawn. It's again under attack, and as you see, both knights control the d5 square. So, as the pawn is under attack, neither pushes it forward. Now it's defended by the bishop. Now, in case white invades d5 right away, black can exchange, and after the second knight captures on d5, the c2 pawn would fall. For this reason, Geller first, as black is dominating the c file, Geller first challenges black's domination on the c file. He plays rook c4, attacking the queen. Queen a6 followed, and now again he makes a prophylactic move. In order to prevent the further advance of the a pawn, he plays b3. And neither finally activates his bishop, bishop b6. He would love to exchange his bishop for the knight. So, of course, Geller doesn't let him do it and plays after first exchanging a pair of rooks with a tempo, check, queen takes c8. Now the knight finally invades d5 with a tempo, attacking the bishop. Black exchanges the pair of knights, and finally Geller achieves his positional goal. He gets a great knight against a bad bishop with a tempo, attacking the bishop. But neither doesn't give up. He keeps creating some threats. Queen c5, threatening immediate checkmate in 1. Of course, Geller doesn't exchange his great knight for the bishop. Instead, he simply plays rook a1, preventing the checkmate. Now white is ready to start a deadly attack on the king side, because his knight controls the whole board and also the king side. Of course, the knight can take part in the attack on the black king. The queen is ready to move to g4, and the pawn might also move to f6. For example, in case black tries to create a counterplay on the queen side by playing a4, Geller can play queen g4, and after a takes b, f6, threatening checkmate on g7. And after g6, he can play queen takes h4, threatening queen h6, followed by queen g7 checkmate. And in case black captures on a1, creating his own threats, queen g1 check, for example, then instead of queen h6, Geller can play knight e7 check, followed by checkmate. So this attack, this potential attack on the king side might be very dangerous, of course. For this reason, neither prevents it by playing queen f2, offering the exchange of the queens, and Geller transitions into the endgame. He exchanges the queens. Queen takes f2, bishop takes f2. So now his knight is greatly placed, his rook is also very active, but his king isn't playing. And the only way to bring the king into play is to move the g-pawn forward to g4 in order to vacate the g2 square for the king, after which the king will move, of course, to the queen side and support the advance of his b-pawn in order to, after which white will create a passed pawn. But how to achieve that? At the moment, of course, if the g-pawn moves forward, black would simply capture en passant, and the black bishop defends the pawn, and black would simply be up a pawn. For this reason, Geller kicks the bishop out of this diagonal, so that he can play g4. In case black stays on this diagonal by playing bishop g3 check, it turns out that the bishop will be completely out of play. It will be locked up. White would play king g1, followed by rook a1, king f2, king f1, king e2, and white will be ready to push the b-pawn forward to create a passed pawn. And this pawn will be supported by the white rook and the knight, while the bishop, the black bishop, cannot return to f2 anymore to control this diagonal. So, of course, the lonely rook cannot wouldn't be able to stop white's passed pawn. For this reason, instead of, after rook f1, instead of bishop g3 check, neither plays bishop d4, so that the bishop stays on this diagonal and might take part in the defense to stop the advance, the potential advance of the b-pawn forward. And also the bishop controls the a1 square, so of course Geller kicks the bishop out of this diagonal. c3, bishop c5. And now, of course, now that the bishop isn't on this diagonal, Geller plays g4. Now his king is ready to be rerouted to the queen side. Of course, neither captures en passant. Now white has a weakness on h3. King takes g3 followed, rook b7 attacking the b3 pawn, rook b1 defending the pawn, and white is ready to push the pawn forward. So white's plan is simple now. He's going to play b4 followed by king f3, e2, d3, c4, after which, of course, the pawn will move forward, supported by the king, the knight, and the rook, and black will lose. For this reason, black cannot just wait. He must immediately create counterplay. That's exactly what Nxd5 does. As the white king is going to move to the queen side, the h3 pawn will be weak. So Nxd5 plays f6. The idea is to move the king to f7, after which the rook's way to h8 will be open and the h3 pawn will fall under attack. King f3 followed, king f7, king e2, rook b8, the rook is ready to move to h8, and b4. The b pawn starts its advance. Nxd5 plays g6. The idea is to capture on f5 and create the second weakness on f5. However, this g6 move was a mistake. Geller could have exploited this mistake, but he didn't notice the tactics, because, as he writes in his annotations, he was completely concentrated on his strategic plan. So he missed the tactics. He could have captured on g6 with a check, and after king takes g6, he could have sacrificed the exchange, capturing on c5, letting black capture his rook, followed by c6. White is threatening to push the pawn forward and promote to the queen. The only way to stop it is rook b8, but in this case, after c7, if black plays rook c8, of course, knight e7, as the king is on g6, would fork and win right away. And in case the rook, instead of moving to c8, moves to any other square, let's say to h8, it doesn't really matter. White would still promote, and after rook takes c8, again, knight e7 would fork and win the rook. But Geller missed this opportunity, and instead of capturing on g6, he kept playing in accordance with his plan. He plays king d3. Nxd5 captures on f5, creating the second weakness in white's position. Now both f5 and h3 are weakened. Now Nxd5 exchanges on b4, and after c takes b, now of course he cannot move his rook, because in this case white would immediately capture the bishop. At the moment white of course cannot capture, as the rook would fall. So in order to be able to play rook h8, Nxd5 moves his bishop to d4, and Geller plays rook c1. So the rook doesn't need to defend the pawn, because the knight defends it, and by playing rook c1, Geller creates an immediate threat of rook c7 check, after which the black king will be forced to retreat to the 8th rank and will be completely out of play. And in case black prevents it by playing rook b7, white would still play rook c7 check, which would lead to the exchange of the rooks, and of course white will easily win, because the pawn will simply move forward. If the black king tries to stop it, moving to the queen side, then of course the h pawn would move forward and one of these pawns will promote to the queen. For this reason, after rook c1, as rook c7 check is threatened, and the king will be forced to move to the 8th rank, in order to keep his king active, Nxd5 plays king g7. And after rook c7 check, the king moves to h6. Now the king is ready to move to g5, attacking the weakness on f5. Of course, in case white captures on f6, the knight would stop defending the pawn and black would simply capture this important pawn. So that would be a mistake. Of course, Geller didn't capture on f6. Instead, he improves his king e4, coming closer to the center and defending the weak f5 pawn. King g5 followed. Rook h7, creating a threat, h4 check, and after king g4, which would be the only move, this time, now that the king would be on g4, white can capture on f6 because it would come with a check. And after the black king moves away from g4, the knight from f6 will return to d5 and defend the b4 pawn. In order to prevent this, the h4 check, black plays bishop f2. Rook g7 check, forcing the black king to move to the h-file. Now the king is cut on the g-file by the rook. But black is threatening to capture on h3. But Geller plays king f3, coming closer to his h-pawn with a tempo, attacking the bishop. And after bishop e1, black is threatening to capture the important b-pawn, but Geller plays king g2, defending the pawn and also indirectly defending the b4 pawn, because by playing king g2 he has created a terrible threat of checkmate in 3 moves. In case black captures on b4, rook g4 check would follow, and after king h5, knight takes f6 check, followed by rook g6 checkmate. For this reason, after king g2, in order to prevent all this, rook g4 check, followed by knight takes f6 check and checkmate, black must defend the f6 pawn, so he plays rook f8. But now that the rook stopped controlling the b file, the b pawn moves forward, b5, bishop a5, b6. White is threatening to promote to the queen in order to deflect the black rook from f8, and after black captures the queen, the pawn would fall, and again the black king would be checkmated after rook g4 check, followed by knight f6 check and rook g6 checkmate. For this reason, neither is forced to give up his bishop. Bishop takes b6, knight takes b6. Now Geller is up a piece. Rook b8, attacking the knight, rook g4 check, king h5 and knight d5, threatening checkmate in 2 moves after knight f6 check, followed by rook g6 checkmate. So there is nothing black can do. He doesn't have any counterplay. In case he tries to create counterplay by playing rook b2 check, then after king f3, rook b3 check, king e4. In case black captures the pawn, then the same checkmate would follow. Knight takes f6 check, followed by rook g6 checkmate. For this reason, after knight d5, in this hopeless position, neither resigned. And now I recommend watching Geller's attacking masterpiece that gives an insight into the nature of a sacrifice and attacking principles. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.